My name is Vindhya. I'm a PhD student in anthropology at University College London. My research is focused on the political work of photography in northern Sri Lanka. So I look at the ways in which photography is mobilized within spaces of resistance and contexts of protest in order to make political claims and grievances known. Um, Part of this is also looking at the very different kinds of photography that have been wielded in these spaces. So I look at a diverse array of photographs that include studio photography, atrocity images, national identity card photographs, and so on and so forth, and the ways in which these are used with kind of equal value and step in political claim making. So I did my fieldwork in Jaffna between 2017 and 2018, and I've just written up. So that is what I research. On the subject of identity, I think you asked specifically to think about it in terms of migration, and also, I guess, how this relates to the idea of the kinds of photography produced in Jaffna. So I think, particularly as an island, migration has been extremely central to our identity rather than external. But unfortunately, because of the ways in which the conflict as well as political culture have played out in Sri Lanka, um, we've always looked at migration as something that isn't integral to our identity when it really is, and particularly the very diversity of the island. And these are aspects that need to be celebrated and recognized and embraced rather than externalized and othered as a means to emphasize our islandness in a way that's not productive to engaging with our histories or imagining our futures and so on. And so I think there's a lot of important work to be done and conversations to be had in understanding the resonance of migration. And obviously, migration also can't be separated from the question of conflict and war in Sri Lanka, where it's amplified the movement of people in and out of the island. And this has obviously taken so much away, but also enriched in different ways. And thinking about this in terms of photography in particular, I thought I'd talk about it in terms of studio photography in Jaffna, which is something that I look at. And it's been really interesting to see the way in which migration and aspirations for migration have shaped the kind of photography that studios are making in Jaffna before the war, during the war, and even now. So for example, we see because of the kind of displacement and dispersal that happened during the war, studios were actually making more and more photographs because this was a way for people to connect with family members, for example, that were scattered across borders and so on. And in many ways, it's because of these migrations as well that a lot of photography from this period has been preserved because the photographs themselves are moving with people. So we see a lot of extraordinary images that were produced in Jaffna that we may no longer see in Jaffna, but we encounter in places like London or Toronto or New York or wherever it is that communities have dispersed and taken photographs with them. And during the course of talking to people about their photographs, I've heard extraordinary stories about the way in which people have made efforts to preserve their family photographs. There are, of course, people who don't have any photographs left because of the war and because of loss and so on and so forth. But there are also people who kind of cherished and carried these as treasured possessions to wherever they went and however they had to get there despite the kind of hardships. And this has meant that there are extraordinary kind of repositories of social history embedded in these photographs that we no longer can see in the space that they were produced. And this, in terms of studio practice, meant that there were, in the kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of people would go into photography studios to have their photographs taken so that they could, share these with family members and so on and so forth. So this is, central to the kinds of economies of photography in Jaffna as well. And on top of that, we also have identity photography. Because of, aspirations and desires for migration, it also meant that there were hundreds and hundreds of images that were being created for the purpose of passports, visas, identity cards, and so on and so forth. And these photographs as well, they didn't really stay static in their uses as, identity photographs. These would then become transformed into memorial portraits, for example. We see, particularly in Jaffna, there's a very vibrant culture of memorial portraiture, right? And a lot of these are those images that were produced as NIC portraits or passport portraits that were then kind of overpainted, transformed. Now you see people doing it with Photoshop and put in these elaborate frames and incorporated into kind of ritual spaces and worship practices and so on and so forth. And these are, again, things that have been amplified in a sense because of the war, because of the way in which society had to come to terms with death and memorialization and commemoration in kind of exaggerated and expanded ways. And similarly, we have the ways in which photography, for example, underpin transnational marriages, about how, people will still go into studios to have these studio portraits taken against these backdrops, which is kind of old-fashioned if you think about it in an age of camera phones and so on, and selfies and so on and so forth. But in all these kind of months and months I spent in Jaffna's various studios, you get like young men and women coming in to have these, beautiful sort of 3/4 length, full length portraits taken. And most of these were used in order to be sent to marriage brokers and circulated to kind of ideally find a spouse elsewhere, right? So, I mean, these are the kind of unlikely ways in which photography underpin migration, but also kind of, inform the imaginings of migration. In summary, it was the ways in which photography kind of helps mediate and help people improvise their aspirations for migration, as well as the ways in which it permits them for imagining their futures and so on and so forth. And that's what I said, the very diverse ways in which photography is used within the social space of Jaffna in particular, historically as well as now, tells us a lot about the ways in which people's aspirations are shaped, I think.
Yeah.
And that is historical as much as, contemporary, because if you look at the ways in which studio photographs are made in the 1950s and 60s, we have a different kind of aspiration, right? People want to be pictured with modern amenities, these beautiful landscapes and so on and so forth, which speak a lot to our relationship to our colonial past as well. Because if you look at a lot of the studio backdrops, they're evoking this colonial aesthetic with these architectural features and so on and so forth. And these are some of the things we still see in studio spaces, right? But this is to mediate a different kind of aspiration that is to do with social and economic mobility and so on. So those are kind of some of the ways in which I guess we could think through popular photography in terms of migration, but also considering the relationship to the war and conflict and what that has meant in terms of people's experiences of citizenship and how they would like to, make futures possible for themselves, as individuals trying to get to grips with uncertainties and, political precarity and so on. Think of photography as a space where we can perform or play out identities in some way, right? It's like everyone goes and poses for a photograph because they want to see something, their best possible self in the photograph, right? No one wants to take a bad picture of themselves. And in a way, photography allows for these identities to be formed in a way that people might see themselves in their best light. And I think particularly, again, if you think about Jaffna and wedding photography, this is a great kind of space in which it plays out. There's this kind of new, well, not really new, but there is this kind of desire to have photography that's inspired by film, particularly South Indian film. So you get this cinema-style photography, which is offered as a package where couples can, do these elaborate photo shoots and so on and so forth, right? And it's a way of saying, this is how I would like to see myself. This is how I would like other people to see myself, and this is the best way in which I can present myself to be remembered and so on, which is also the kind of social function of photography and the way in which we want to preserve a sliver of the present for the future, right? So there's a lot of kind of fantasy involved in that, which kind of tells you the ways in which identities are ultimately imagined, and the ways in which photography plays a role in how we present ourselves. And I think that is what's most interesting, right? And a lot of this, again, if you think about it in terms of migration and this kind of idea of influences moving around, whether, you know, it's within the community, from outside the community, all of these things also shape the aesthetics of how we present ourselves, right? So, for example, when a couple in Jaffna put their wedding picture in front of a Photoshop backdrop of a Tanjore temple, what is it telling us about, Hinduism, or, you know, Tamil cultural identity, and what it means to, you know, belong to this larger identity of Tamilness? Or is it a form of culture loss, which some other people see, where they say, oh, well, this isn't authentic to our culture, and so on. So there are lots of questions and tensions that play out on the kind of surfaces and aesthetics of these photographs. And I think that's what's really interesting. It allows people to experiment with their identities, allows people to perform different aspects of their identities. And we've always seen this happen, because if you look at older studio photographs, again from like the 1970s, it's a very common thing for people to come to the studio and dress up in traditional clothing as well as Western clothing, right? So there are all these always two photographs taken where you see a, you know, a young woman, or let's say a young couple in, like, you know, a suit, and the girl is in like a skirt and a top, and then this same couple will have themselves photographed, you know, in traditional like sari and veti and so on and so forth, right? So this is the way in which, you know, this becomes a space in which we can kind of express and articulate our identities. And I think that's kind of brilliant, isn't it? And technology, in a way, has allowed us to experiment, but it's also not to say that it hasn't always been happening, because if we see the studio space in Jaffna, they've always been improvising and using props and using, you know, costumes and various things and backdrops in order to help clients, you know, picture themselves in a desirable way. So I think that's a really interesting way in order for us to understand identity and the way it plays out. I mean, Jaffna's photography history is really interesting, because I think, for one thing, is that it is arguably one of the first, if not the first place in Sri Lanka where photography was introduced. And I think there's very compelling evidence to say that. So we're looking at historical photographers who were working in the late 19th century, who were Tamil photographers working in Jaffna, like Lawton and Martin, who were, you know, actively contributing to the technical development of photography, which is extraordinary, because you see people like Lawton, for example, writing technical treatises that he published in London, you know, about preserving negatives and tinting, you know, photography and coloring and so on and so forth. And there's this whole vibrant life of photography that existed in Jaffna in the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century. But what we see after that is this kind of gap in terms of, we don't really know what happened. One reason, obviously, is the war and the kind of loss associated with it. But the other thing is also the kind of lack of attention paid to everyday photography, right? Because people are like, oh, it's a studio photograph, there's not much skill that goes into it, and so on. But if you look at the way in which studio photographers themselves were taking pictures and experimenting and innovating and capturing and documenting their lives and the lives of their clients, we see a huge amount of innovation. It's just that it hasn't been given that attention the way in which, you know, the photography of Lionel Wendt has been given attention, even though we see a lot of similarities in terms of the, you know, subjects that people were interested in and the kinds of photographs that they were taking. So it's difficult to say historically what exactly, for example, amateur practice looked like early 20th century in Jaffna, but we know that there were vibrant connections to Colombo. We know that there were vibrant connections to the world outside, particularly through figures like Lawton. And I think as we go on, we see studios as a big part of where these innovations took place. And a lot of these studio photographers, they don't always think of themselves as, you know, artists necessarily, but they are, and they are making art, right? Whether it's in terms of how they, you know, overpaint their photographs, or they're like, you know, playing around with lighting and so on and so forth. So these are kind of conversations. It's an incomplete conversation, but there's still so much work to be done in terms of preservation and understanding and kind of tracing these lineages as well, because I think one of the remarkable things is with a lot of the older studios in Jaffna, a lot of the older photographers can say, I learned from so and so, my teacher learned from so and kind of trace their learning of studio photography back a few generations, which I think is extraordinary because you don't really see that anywhere. And that kind of shows how much respect there is to kind of learning the craft and their teachers and, fine tuning their skills and so on and so forth. So there's a wealth of knowledge that needs to be kind of preserved. And it's amazing to see kind of younger photographers getting involved and getting interested and trying to preserve this stuff as well, which we've kind of seen in the last year in Japan in particular. So that I think is something where the momentum needs to carry through and to preserve what we can while we can still do it. So these are, I guess, as I said, a kind of, little pieces of a bigger puzzle where all of us need to be, putting our little bits of work in order to make sure that we can preserve what's left. Hand-colored photographs were a way in which, at a time where photography was predominantly black and white, it was it was like a value add-on thing, right? Like now, you go into a studio, you get something photoshopped. It's kind of the same premise. And this was something that you observe, across South Asia. If you look at examples from India, hand painting was very much a part of, how photography studios added value to the services that we offered. And obviously in Jaffna, there is a tradition of hand painting. There's still like a couple of people who used to do it back in the day, who have now kind of seamlessly transitioned to Photoshop and do the exact same thing that they used to do with brush and ink on Photoshop, right? Which also highlights the way in which that particular aesthetic is still valued. And you see this a lot with kind of the preservation of older photographs as well as memorial portraits, where we see Photoshopped images, but these are kind of overpainted in a way on a computer that is reminiscent of overpainted photographs from like the 50s and the 60s, right? So there's something to be said about the role of these studios and overpainters and artists in also locating this work within the kind of image world of Jaffna and the aesthetics of Jaffna, right? And we see the way in which these also draw inspiration from things like cinema hoardings or divine prints and portraits, because there's a huge amount of visual cultural exchange that's happening with South India, for example, where the divine icons and images and so on again are a big part of Jaffna's visual world, right? You go into a shop, you see the god pictures, and you see someone's grandmother, grandfather, parents, all in this kind of wonderful constellation of worship. And it's beautiful, and it's about how we remember the dead and how we respect them and so on. We position them in line with the gods that we worship, and those kind of aesthetic tropes as well seem to influence and shape the ways in which we situate this within our world. So I think the overpainting is a big part of that, because it draws influence and inspiration from the kinds of mass printing and print culture aesthetics that exist. So one of the, I think, the interesting ways in which caste and class play out, if we look at photography historically in terms of early 20th century, it was very much the purview of the wealthy, right? You had to be able to afford to go into a studio and get the photograph taken and so on and so forth. And I think in a wide, I mean, I'm not a historian, I have to say this very specifically. I'm an anthropologist. I look at contemporary photography. The only kind of historical work I've done is to do with kind of situating what is happening in the present, in terms of some vague development of what photography constituted in Jaffna. But I think one of the ways in which a shift happened was the introduction of the ID card. Because in the early 1970s, with the introduction of the National Identity Card project, it meant that every Sri Lankan over the age of 16 had to go into a studio to get themselves photographed, right? And this would be the kind of turning point in a way as well, where something that was previously kind of determined maybe by class and caste and access and so on became mandatory within the space of a year, right? And this would mean that everyone who was an adult, because obviously you can't really navigate the Sri Lankan space without an identity card anymore, right? And particularly during that time as well. So this would mean that more people were going into studios. And I think one of the roles that the studio played was also to use this identity card to turn it into other kinds of photographs, right? So, like I was saying before about the memorial portrait, we see a lot of national identity card photographs, which are then in turn overpainted and enlarged and rephotographed and so on and so forth, and turned into a keepsake or a personal photograph or a memorial portrait and so on and so forth, right? So this little identity card photograph would completely transform the ways in which society, like Sri Lankan society as a whole, had access to photography, right? Um, in and this is really, really interesting because obviously spaces and mobility, particularly again within the space of Jaffna, is very kind of like separated by gender, separated by class and caste, and so on and so forth, right? And I think one of the ways in which we can see the way caste has kind of filtered into the photography space is through the skills involved, right? So we have, people who are from artisanal communities who were involved in things like painting and so on, taking up photography, right? So we see, some of the people I've met who are involved in overpainting are people who come from kind of families who've been involved in that kind of stuff. Maybe not specifically within studio photography, but they've been doing it in some other form before that. So there's always been a level of, these threads pulling communities together in the types of work that they do, right? So this is really interesting because this would also kind of, supplement the other peripheral industries. Like if you go on to, I don't know, Castaria Road in Jaffna, you get like all the printing shops. The printing shops are involved in, making wedding albums, but also in making those little like funeral poster hand-built things that you put on the wall. So those are the ways in which these, different things that are threaded together kind of cross-pollinate in a way as well, which has to do with, print culture, aesthetics, and so on and so forth. These photographs, at least in my experience, and in the kind of limited time frame that I've looked at the historical material, are quite rare, but they do exist. And I think personally, I feel like even with a lot of the personal photographs, there's a lot of attention paid to what's in the backdrop and what is the kind of surrounding landscape. And you see this significantly even with things like family photographs, right? And again, I think this is to some extent because of war loss and so on and so forth, and displacement and so on. And this means that people are looking at personal photographs and also paying a lot of attention to not just who's in the photograph, but what else is in the photograph, right? And I think particularly considering this tension of Sri Lanka's post-war and the changes happening to the landscape, which are extraordinarily political, the conflict in a sense persists in the landscape and these tensions, right? Where people are trying to get to grips with the changes that are being imposed on a space that's becoming increasingly unrecognizable. And photography, in a way, has been a space that allows people to document and preserve what the landscape looked like, but also in articulating, how they feel about the place and how they feel about their belonging and so on and so forth. And this you see with younger photographers in particular, if they're making images for Instagram or whatever it is. But you also see this with older photographers. One of the older photographers that I worked with has been taking photographs since, the 1950s. From what little images are left from what he has taken over the years, we see a kind of concerted effort to document changes to the landscape, and you can clearly see it kind of morphing from black and white to color, and you see these new changes and inclusions in the landscape that are happening because of the war, for example, right? You see the kind of militarization aspect becoming more prominent, right? He takes a picture of the market and there's this kind of jeep idling on the side, or there's a soldier stray walking around, or you see the kind of aid and development humanitarian apparatus coming in with these new buildings and developments and so on and so forth. And these are the ways in which changes to the landscape become unintentionally charted, right? And similarly, if you look at the work of younger photographers, a lot of them, having grown up in this kind of strange post-war period, are trying to get to grips with these histories that are so dominated by these kind of louder hegemonic narratives where there isn't a lot of space to kind of really think and reflect and understand how we fit into this kind of narrative, right? And I think photography has been a really important place or medium through which people have been allowed to, or people have created the space for themselves to discuss and reflect and come to grips with what their world and how their world is changing and how it was, impacted by the war, and what it might look like going forward, whether it's kind of serving a function of remembering and memory and narrative and so on, because that's a big part of it, right? Like the spaces for remembering are shrinking, right? And people are struggling to keep alive certain aspects of, their history and so on. And, photography is a powerful way in which people can engage with this stuff. And this, again, this is not to say that this is something that happened just with Instagram or just with Facebook or whatever it is, right? This is something photographers have been doing. It's just that we have so little material to go on that we don't always see it. But when we do look at the material that does exist, we see really powerful visual narratives in terms of how photography has served a purpose of, documenting the way of life, the landscape and so on and so forth. And looking back on it now, it's so precious because we don't see some of these things anymore. And this is also really interesting because you see, like, younger photographers in particular, reviving an interest in documenting traditional arts and crafts and occupations and so on and so forth. And these are really powerful ways of also, linking to conversations about caste and class and, things like that as well, right? Because these are the kinds of difficult conversations that isn't always, the easiest thing to start talking about. But when we have these kind of little visual prompts, hopefully we can do.